Indigenous peoples face an unprecedented crisis, and the challenge is clear. We need to unite to win. This August 9, we are coming together to celebrate the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples, even under the hardest and harshest lockdowns and huge challenges. Our situation begs the question, where can the 476 million Indigenous peoples around the world draw inspiration to mark this day?
Amid the pandemic's restrictions, the entry of business and state projects in ancestral lands did not slow down. Illegal mining, state infrastructures, and disruptive projects took advantage of the quarantined population, endangering indigenous communities from the COVID-19 and land grabs. Indigenous peoples are for the longest time disproportionately affected by different types of health crises, even before the COVID-19 pandemic. In addition to poverty and inaccessible healthcare services, many indigenous peoples live in isolated or distant villages where services are difficult to get, limited or non-existent. While indigenous communities mitigate the pandemic's impact with communal efforts and traditional practices, the violence, criminalization, killings, and terrorist tagging intensified, and this added another threat to their lives. These attacks, which are linked to state forces and big businesses against the lives of those defending their lands and rights, those protesting against the government's poor pandemic response and anti-people policies, are being carried out with the deadly virus of impunity. The fight against the COVID-19 pandemic has also been weaponized by state forces against indigenous people's struggle for recognition and genuine freedom. The government's failure to address peace, justice, and accountability continues to drive conflict and violence. Issues of internal displacements, land exploitation, and human rights violations remain unaddressed as governments launch fascist attacks against movements for self-determination. But indigenous peoples are not taking this sitting down, making waves in the front lines of defense of rights, land, life, and freedom. Indigenous people stand strong even during the pandemic. With their visibility and actions on ground, the victory of assertion is cutting across nations, territories, and communities. It is building unities among indigenous peoples with their allies and advocates. The dominant world order needs more than recovery. It demands transformation. It means ending discrimination, dismantling structures of colonialism and imperialism, eradicating inequality, and destroying the roots of oppression and injustice against indigenous peoples and other marginalized sectors of society.
We are taking the struggle forward.
Onwards with our fight for land, life, and freedom.
Adelante con nuestra lucha por la tierra, la vida y la libertad.
Let's
Let us
unite to win.
Let's unite to win.
Let's unite to win.
Let's unite to win.
Struggle for self-determination and liberation.
Luis Ayago, Kandatakwam, warmest greetings to all our participants in Zoom and viewers in Facebook. We hope that you are well and safe from the coronavirus and attacks due to our development work. I am Beverly Longit, the Global Coordinator of the International Indigenous Peoples Movement for Self-Determination and Liberation, or IPMSDL. I shall be facilitating our online event. For those who are new or who don't know it yet, the IPMSDL, the International IPMSDL, serves as the Secretariat of the Indigenous Peoples Constituency of the CSO Partnership for Development Effectiveness, or CPDE. So in behalf of the constituency, welcome to the online discussion and launching of the book, Grounding the CSO Development Effectiveness Principles, or CSODE, Indigenous Peoples Principles and Guidelines for Development Effectiveness. Before we proceed, just a quick reminder for all of us, if you haven't done so, please rename yourself to include the name or acronym of your organization and or your country of origin. Kindly turn off your microphone and unmute it when it is your time to speak. Let us help minimize the background noise. And last, we can use the raise hand option or type in our questions or comments in the Zoom chat or the FB comment section. Now, for today's event, this is as a follow-up to today's webinar. The CPDE Indigenous Peoples Constituency shall be publishing a compilation of case stories from Indigenous peoples organizations on the Istanbul Principles. We hope that at the end of today's webinar, many of you are here, that we got your attention so that you can collaborate with us in sharing your most recent experiences on the application or implementation of development effectiveness principles. The case stories actually involve simple research, and documentation, focusing on one of the 8 principles. And for those who would be interested, organizations or communities, you can write to us in not more than 300 words, expressing your intent to participate and then indicating the specific principle that you would like to speak of or research on, and then the abstract of your proposed case story. And don't worry, because we have 2 speakers who will discuss what are these CSO development effectiveness principles. So let's start the ball rolling. We are very fortunate tonight or this afternoon to have with us two speakers, no, who are very knowledgeable and who are also involved on CSO development effectiveness work. We shall be interacting with them at the both of them, no, at the end of their presentations. We have recorded their presentations so that we'll be able to, their presentations, their input will not be affected just in case there's a problem with their internet connections. Okay, so our first speaker shall discuss the history and background of the 8 CSO development effectiveness principles, including a general description of these principles. So let us welcome Mr. Jodel Dacara of the CSO Platform for Development Effectiveness, or CPDE. Jodel?
Mabuhay! Greetings of solidarity from the CPDE Global Secretariat. I am Jodel Dacara. I'm the current network manager of CPDE. And today I will be discussing some concepts and provide clarity on the idea of civil society organization and what development effectiveness is for our sector. So our presentation will follow this outline. First, I will discuss with you what are the roles and voices of civil society and development, what are the history and the concept of CSO development effectiveness, the dimensions of CSO DE, and the context and the current challenges to CSO work in different sectors globally. I know that this presentation will only be a review for others, but I hope that we will provide some new ideas also on what are the current challenges to CSO development effectiveness. So we begin our discussion with the basic question: who are CSOs? When we say civil society organizations, who are we talking about? And who are we talking to? So CSOs are self-organized, non-market, non-state, or voluntary formations pursuing common interests and goals. So we are a private sector acting in public interest. Thus, we are a legitimate expression of citizens' right to association and expression. As such, our legitimacy is innate. So whenever CSO legitimacy are being questioned, our answer is that we are an expression of citizens' right to association and expression, which are actually fundamental rights of individuals. But we are currently subject to constant challenges because of public interest regarding our independence and legitimacy. Sometimes we are challenged because of the idea of not being a bona fide organization, such as the suitcase NGOs, as we call them in different developing countries. Some NGOs are also being accused of being agents or principally being involved in profit concerns, such as those are foundations and performing corporate social responsibility. And also, we are being accused of being adjuncts of governments involved in governance. Often, civil society organizations like us operate on the basis of shared values, beliefs, objectives with the people we serve and represent. As such, there are many types of CSOs. Some are called people's organizations, some are social movements, some are NGOs, some are networks, and some are platforms. So there are differences in the types. There are also differences in the scale and scope, focus, nature of membership, operations. Regardless, we are all considered civil society organizations. So what do we do? So we've already answered the question, who are we? But now what do we do as part of the society? So as an expression of people's rights and institution of democracy, we have a unique mandate of providing an enabling environment for citizens to claim their rights. And we do this through 3 main channels and areas. First, we do advocacy and capacity building through raising awareness and educating citizens about their rights and gathering and processing with them their concerns, needs, and aspirations. Second, we do empowerment and self-organization through organizing and mobilizing peoples to participate in decision-making through persistent struggle, both inside and outside official arenas and processes. When we say inside and outside, we also pertain to protesting outside and also engaging different official arenas. So both of these are actually under empowerment and self-organization. And lastly, we also do this through social transformation and building of democracy. So we are acting as interlocutors for governance, bridging ground issues such as the issues of the indigenous peoples, indigenous communities in different countries, to official discussions and vice versa. This could be done through representation on behalf of citizens or creating spaces for citizens themselves to join discussions in different fronts or arenas. These channels, these three channels that I am discussing, advocacy and capacity building, empowerment and self-organization, and social transformation and building of democracy, are not actually new, are not exclusive. Rather, they are connected to each other and actually reinforce each other towards a common goal, which is to enable citizens to claim their right, as what I've already mentioned earlier. And towards that mandate of enabling people to claim their rights, we fulfill different roles in the society. First, we provide systematic and critical representation of citizens' voices and public interest in different arenas. So CSOs like us do not represent citizens in the same way that representatives or parliamentarians do in government. But we provide critical representation of citizens' voices or public interest in different areas and branches of government, and also in other arenas like multilateral institutions. We organize and mobilize the public on issues of development. We also act as watchdogs and advocates. We facilitate public participation in government policies and programs, and we provide services to them, especially now that we are under this pandemic. So in society with different levels of social classes and distinctions, there will always be those left behind, those who fall through the cracks, so to speak. So there will always be sectors that are underrepresented and underserved, but which are sometimes totally ignored by the governments. So most of the time, they do not have the voice or do not have someone reminding them that they should actually be in the first place of this government services. So this is what we do. This is the role that many civil society organizations, workers, human rights defenders, and activists, at least those that are enlightened, fulfill. So we are becoming the voice of the voiceless, so to speak, and we are actually the ones who remind the authorities that it should be the people that they ought to serve. So since we are playing vital roles in pursuing people-centered development, enabling people to claim their rights, shape development policies and partnerships, and pursue accountability, we are considered independent development actors in our own right. So why is it this important? So when different development actors recognize that we are also independent development in our own right, this means that we have our capacity, that we have our power, that we have our role in actually shaping development policies and be part of the discussions at equal footing with governments and other development actors like the private sector. So this recognition, however, was not given to us in a silver platter, no? So it was not when we asked them, recognize us as development actors, independent development actors, and then the government just gave it to us. No, it was actually a result of persistent struggle to recognize our independence and legitimacy and the vital roles that we play in different countries. So at least in the development cooperation arena where CPD is working, CSOs have been recognized as independent development actors in our own right since 2008. And for Agenda 2030 or the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, civil society like us have been acknowledged as partners for development. So now we go to what is the concept of development effectiveness and why are we talking about it? No? What it is and why is it relevant for us, civil society? So civil society, if you will see in this diagram, civil society have been advocating for development effectiveness since 2008. We have been advocating for development effectiveness as a new agenda in 2008 to shift the discussion from that very technical aid effectiveness, or just talking about how aid should be given to developing countries, to actually a more thoroughgoing agenda, which is development effectiveness. And such, CPDE was born out of these CSO processes. So what is development effectiveness, and what do we mean when we say development effectiveness? What is the concept behind this? So development effectiveness is about promoting sustainable change within a democratic framework that addresses the root causes as well as symptoms of poverty, inequality, and marginalization. It places human rights, social justice, gender equality, and ecological sustainability at the core of aid relations and the development processes. So what underlies DE is actually a shift in power relations to give power and agency to the people to decide their own development path based on their needs and aspirations, to transform the notion of development away from the very excessive focus on economic growth to a more encompassing approach based on people's development. As such, the principles that underlie development effectiveness are empowerment, justice, sustainability, equality, solidarity, sovereignty, self-reliance, and autonomy. So development effectiveness implies a policy environment more resonant with human rights, poverty eradication, consultation, and people's participation and empowerment, especially of the poor and the marginalized. It creates opportunities and instruments for civil society like us to push for democratization and to counter policies and programs contrary to human rights and welfare of rural poor, and presents opportunities for engagement at different levels depending on interests of CSOs and social movements. As we know it, especially indigenous peoples, organizations, and communities, as we know it, sometimes development, there's too much excess focus on an economic notion of development that is not really aligned with rights-based development or the right to development of the people. So development effectiveness is basically a counter to that existing narrative of what development is. So while we called on the governments and other development actors that they should pursue development effectiveness instead of that very narrow, excessive focus on economic growth, we were also challenged to demonstrate our development effectiveness as CSOs. So we said that, okay, we will pursue our advocacy for development effectiveness in among governments and other development actors, while we also look into ourselves and define amongst ourselves what development effectiveness is for CSOs. So CSOs had a process since 2008 on defining what CSO development effectiveness is. So because we believe that as development actors, we are also subject to development effectiveness, but we require different principles of DE, particularly formulated for CSOs' role as enablers of people to claim their rights. So for us, this is what is called CSO development effectiveness, which is basically a goal to improve the quality of our development practice based on human rights framework and guiding principles. So basically, this is the attempt of civil society organizations to basically walk the talk. And we've succeeded in that. So for us, this is our definition of CSO development effectiveness. So this definition didn't only come from CPDE or the Better Aid or the Open Forum before. This is actually the result of a process of consultations for 3 years among different organizations globally. And they came up with this definition. So CSO development effectiveness speaks to the impact of our actions for development, especially on the lives of the poor and the marginalized population. So it also talks about how we improve our capacity as development actors to promote sustainable positive change based on people's rights and genuine development that addresses the root causes and the symptoms of poverty, inequality, and injustice through the delivery and complementarities of different policy instruments and outcomes. So we are very much cognizant of our role in providing the voice and enable the people to claim their rights and provide them and work with them actually towards genuine development that is based on their aspirations and their rights. Thus, it is important agenda for CSOs like us to solidify the legitimacy and the purpose of our existence. So when we talk about CSO development effectiveness, there are actually three main dimensions of what CSO is. So first, there is what we call the Istanbul Principles, and other mechanisms apply to CSOs as private voluntary actors in the public interest. So apart from the Istanbul Principles, we also have accountability mechanisms. Second dimension is advocacy for enabling environment, which is actually about the recognition of CSOs as independent development actors in our own right, fulfilling different roles in society. The government should provide us enabling legislation and other mechanisms and provide us support. And lastly, partnerships and collaboration and solidarity. So in a few minutes, I will be talking about each of these dimensions. So dimension one is the Istanbul Principles and other mechanisms. I believe that the Secretariat of the Indigenous Peoples Sector will be providing you this document, what are the Istanbul Principles and other mechanisms that we can use to pursue CSO development effectiveness. So the Istanbul Principles were formulated for the purpose of defining what civil society or what CSO development effectiveness is, and has since been accepted into the Busan Partnership document for the recognition and the implementation of all concerned development actors. So if you will see the Istanbul Principles here, these are actually not new. These are not new principles or practices for CSOs and in people's organization like us. So these principles talk about respecting and promoting human rights and social justice, embodying gender equality and promoting women's and girls' rights, people's empowerment, democratic ownership and participation, promoting environmental sustainability, practicing transparency and accountability, especially to our constituents or beneficiaries, pursue equitable and partnerships and solidarity, creating, sharing knowledge, and commit to mutual learning, and committing to realizing positive, sustainable change. So this, as I've mentioned, these are not new. So maybe in your own organizations, you have been practicing all of this or maybe some of this since time immemorial. So these are just an affirmation of the core values and beliefs that we uphold for a long time as development actors, working for positive, sustainable change to empower the marginalized to claim their rights. So these principles are actually shared by various CSOs globally, and were consolidated to a process of consultations from 2008 to 2010. So the Istanbul Principles have been here for more than 10 years, and were reaffirmed in a global assembly in Istanbul on 2010. So if you'll actually see these Istanbul Principles, these are just the manifestations of the consolidation of the many practices, many core beliefs that we've already been doing for decades. So these are not new, and these are actually just a process of our collaboration. These are the products of mutual learning, so to speak. The second dimension of CSO development effectiveness is advocacy for enabling environment. So in the Busan Partnership document in 2011, it was mentioned in paragraph 22 that CSOs play a vital role in enabling people to claim their rights. So it was already recognized then, 1 decade ago. Recognizing this, the government and other development actors have the responsibility to provide us conducive environment where CSOs can fulfill their roles free from interference. They should provide a general recognition for CSOs, provide us special legislation, regulation, and protection, especially for those that are fulfilling roles such as human rights defending, and also service delivery, advocacy, and policy. They should provide us interlocution and accreditation mechanisms, and in some cases, also provide us funding for our activities. They should also be providing us space for interaction and interface and other mechanisms that are deemed important for civil society organization. So, recognizing these roles, the governments, it was said in Busan that the governments will implement fully their commitments to enable CSOs to exercise their roles as independent development actors with a particular focus on enabling environment, and encourage CSOs to implement practices that strengthen their accountability and their contribution to development effectiveness. So these are in paper, but in practice, of course, there are varying progress in how this is implemented since 10 years ago. And as we know it, we are also facing some challenges as in our operations, in our practice. And later, I will be discussing some of those. The third dimension of CSODE pertains to partnership, collaborations, and solidarity work. And we are very much aware of it. I think the IP constituent is very much cognizant of the importance of partnership and collaboration, not just within the sector, but also outside the sector, particularly in collaboration with different sectors and different organizations, performing work at the global, regional, and country level. So CSOD principles apply to partnership and networks pertain to empowerment, autonomy, and independence. It should be pro-people. It looks at just and transformative change. There should be transparency and accountability, and there should always be mutual trust and the spirit of solidarity. But of course, this is not new. If the CSO development effectiveness are not new things for us, especially this challenges to our work. So what are some of the challenges that CSOs globally face? So these are just some listing, and I'm sure that for the Indigenous peoples organizations, you have also faced different challenges apart from this, no? So first, the main problem that we are currently facing is the issue of shrinking and closing civic space, which is actually experienced differently in different countries. So, for instance, there are disabling legal and regulatory environment. For example, the Anti-Terror Act or law in the Philippines that provides broad and vague definition of what terrorism is and what constitutes act terrorism, which is basically infringing on our constitutional guaranteed rights to association and participation and expression. So legal and regulatory environment is just one aspect of shrinking and closing civic space. At the other end of this shrinking and closing civic space continuum, we experience extrajudicial killings, human rights violations, including peasants, especially targeting the peasants. There's also the issue of militarism in indigenous communities in different countries. There's also limited participation in policy spaces, especially at the country level. So there's also governments, especially the populist governments, that are vilifying CSOs as instruments of social discontent and disruption of the social order. So, like for instance, what happened in Indonesia in their Ormas law that outlines registration requirements and at one side, but at the other end, these are also shrinking the possibility of CSOs enjoying space for participation at the governance level. There's also limited and controlled access to resources. For instance, in India and some other South Asian countries, there's what we call the Foreign Contributions Regulation Act, which actually regulates the flow of foreign funding into the country. So Indian nonprofits, which is actually one of the biggest in the world must have valid FCRA registration to receive prior approval from their Ministry of Home Affairs so that they will be able to receive money from outside, even if it's like money that is given to the Indian NGOs for service delivery to their constituencies. It still be subjected to scrutiny by the government. So these challenges are actually limiting the capacity of civil society organizations to fulfill their roles, especially to their beneficiaries or their constituents. Of course, there's also the issue of donor-driven, northern-favored funding. So we know it already that sometimes the money money for civil society organizations are going to or channeled through northern CSOs. That's why southern CSOs, especially people's organization, are having a hard time accessing money that is actually necessary for them to mobilize peoples and do their own activities. And lastly, there are also other CSOs that are adjuncts of big business and the state. So these are NGOs that are being captured for business and state interest. And apart from these challenges, there are also other challenges that we are currently facing. For instance, a pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, which actually limits the capacity and the space for CSOs to fulfill their service delivery mandate, for instance. And also being used as a pretext by governments to actually curtail the rights of CSOs to operate. So we have experienced it in different countries, in the Philippines and also in Africa and also in Latin America. So these are being used against or weaponized by the government against civil society organizations. So I will stop here. I think the next presentation will talk about how the civil society development effectiveness can be used by indigenous peoples organizations. And thank you so much. If you have questions, you may contact the Global Secretariat. And of course, the Indigenous Peoples Secretariat will be here to respond as well. Thank you and have a nice day. Mabuhay. Much. If you have questions, you may contact the Global Secretariat, and of course, the Indigenous Peoples Secretariat will be here to respond as well. Thank you, and have a nice day.
Thank you very much, Jadel, for that presentation. Our online event today is also serves as a briefing session for our partners who will be working with us, collaborating with the CPDE Indigenous Peoples Constituency, as I mentioned, in relation to developing case studies on the practice of CSO development effectiveness principles. Thank you, Judel, for walking us through. I think there are three takeaways for me in relation to your input. One will be the definition on what constitutes civil society organizations. So this would also include people's movements, organizations on the ground, and the need to further define the term because or probably to clarify the term, given that there are many so-called pseudo or probably non-existent organizations. Two would be, you have unpacked the discourse, because for those who are new on the development effectiveness discourse or narrative, it would probably be quite, we might find it quite highly technical or highly academic. And then giving it that kind of discussion is a way to further ground or simplify the work, or probably connect CSO development effectiveness with the realities on the ground. And of course, the third issue of enabling environment, and that's a major challenge for indigenous peoples and other civil society organizations. So thank you, Judel. And then to connect us, no, with the application on, or what does, I mean, what is development effectiveness for indigenous peoples? We are very happy that we have with us a colleague, a comrade, who will discuss what are, or who shall discuss the Istanbul Principles as applied by indigenous peoples, no, in their assertion of our rights to lands, waters, and territories, and for self-determination. So, friends, let us welcome Mr. Jiten Yumnam of the Center for Research and Advocacy, or CRAM, from Manipur. Welcome, Jiten.
Hi, this is Jiten Yumnam. I will be sharing today on the civil society development effectiveness principles with specific relevance to the indigenous peoples. Is also shared by Jodel. The Istanbul Principles and other provides a very comprehensive principles related to the civil society development effectiveness principles. When it comes to the indigenous peoples, many of these principles are really, really important in advancing effective development in indigenous peoples' territories and land and territories. So, for example, some of the key principles of Istanbul Principles includes the principles of upholding human rights and social justice, and then, of course, promoting gender equality, promoting environmental sustainability, promoting transparency and accountability, promoting positive social change, and fostering an equitable partnership. And I think these are some of the major principles which are very much relevant for indigenous peoples, in advancing effective development in the land and territories. For when it comes to some of the principles, Istanbul Principles, one of the major principles is from advancing human rights and social justice. This is really important because for indigenous peoples, asserting the rights over the land and resources, I think this is really, really important. Affirming the self-determination and also pursuing the self-determined development over indigenous people's land and their traditional land, the ancestral domain. I think this is really, really important, especially with the aggressive pursuance of development cooperation and other development processes which negatively impact indigenous peoples. They're impacting their right to life, impacting their livelihood, impacting their culture, impacting their tradition, impacting their way of life. So I think it's really important that indigenous peoples, as part of advancing development effectiveness and also as an independent development actor, it's really important to advance indigenous peoples' self-determination and also indigenous peoples' right over the land and resources. Because this right is what many of the development stakeholders, the government, the financiers, and many of the multinational corporate bodies, they have failed to recognize, they have failed to uphold in many of the development cooperation process in indigenous people's land and territories. The second principle is advancing gender equality. When it comes to indigenous people's land and territory, it's really important to acknowledge the fact that it's the indigenous women that takes a very important role in sustaining indigenous people's culture, their way of life, including indigenous food system, indigenous traditional agriculture, the knowledge about seeds, the knowledge about preserving seeds, and then upholding the indigenous, diversified and also unique agricultural practices. And also it's the indigenous women that takes a very important role, not just in the indigenous agriculture, but also collection of seasonal food, seasonal vegetables, seasonal wild vegetables and other food species from the forest, from wetlands, and from other food sources. And yet again, it's a woman that takes a very important role in trading many of the food, seasonal food and traditional and native food to the local market, in many cases, again, run by women. So it's really, really important that the woman's traditional role and traditional participation in the traditional economy. I think this is acknowledged in all the development process, and this is also important because what we find is many of the development process, in development cooperation process, it is really failed to acknowledge the role of indigenous women, and also in many occasions it also evict and displace indigenous women from their, not just from the land, but even from their traditional agriculture, traditional economic practices. So it's really important that we promote indigenous women's role and rights in all the development cooperation process. Another very, very important aspect of upholding development effectiveness principles is advancing the environmental sustainability. This is extremely important for many of the indigenous community, and then many of the indigenous community live in forest areas, in wetland areas, and then in most in areas with the unique and also the last remaining biodiversity, like very diversified flora and fauna, which plays an important role in sustaining their, not just a way of life, but also sustaining their culture, unique way of life, and unique distinct identities. What we also see is the increased pursuits of development aggression or unsustainable development posts in many of the development cooperation process, such as the construction of large dams, the construction of the pursuits of extractive industry, mining, oil exploration. And now it's really important for indigenous people's organizations to promote environmental sustainability because of the development aggression, and also because of the unsustainable forms of development process that impact not just on the land and forest and agricultural land, and not just that impact on indigenous people's way of life and their livelihood sources. We see a lot of the destructive form of development process now, as I also mentioned, construction of large dam, mining projects, large infrastructure projects, agribusiness, for example, which are destroying indigenous people's land and resources and their forests, which destroy the culture and the tradition. So it's really, really important that the sustainability of the environment is promoted. And also many indigenous peoples live in territories with very rich flora and fauna and floral species, and then these are unique heritage, natural heritage, and also which forms a very important cultural heritage for many of the indigenous communities. So promoting the environment, promoting the flora, fauna, promoting the biodiversity, which indigenous peoples live along together. I think this is really, really important, and indigenous organizations need to take a very important role in advancing and promoting environment sustainability. And this is also important because the protection of environment sustainability, I think it will also help in mitigating and adaptation to the climate change, because climate crisis is already a concern all over the world, and the impact are increasingly felt in indigenous land and territory. One of the impact, another principle that we also need to talk about is the principle of country ownership and inclusive participation. This is really important for indigenous peoples because the non-recognition of indigenous people's right over the land resources, the issues of exclusion, the issues of discrimination of indigenous peoples while pursuing unsustainable and destructive form of development. I think this is one of the biggest concern among the indigenous communities. And the rightful participation and also acknowledging the indigenous people's right over their land and resources. And this is also clearly enunciated, outlined in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, whereby the ownership rights, the right of communities over the land and resources, I think this is very much a fundamental principle of their human right, their right over their right to self-determination. I think the principle of country ownership, I think this is extremely crucial, extremely important for indigenous community.
Beyond this participation rights is the recognition of our right to self-determination. So that is where the application of the CSO development effectiveness principles becomes more meaningful, becomes more effective for indigenous peoples. Two would be when we apply when we apply these development effectiveness principles, it is also with the objective or has this result of advancing our struggles and of course the indigenous peoples movement to defend our lands, waters and territories and for self-determination. So thank you very much, G10, for that presentation. So again, we will have a quick break. Then we can have a few questions and answers later. But before that, let's watch this video entitled "Indigenous Peoples Unite to Win." Indigenous peoples face an unprecedented crisis and the challenge is clear. We need to unite to win. This August 9, we are coming together to celebrate the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples, even under the hardest and harshest lockdowns and huge challenges. Our situation begs the question, where can the 476 million indigenous peoples around the world draw inspiration to mark this day?
Amid the pandemic's restrictions, the entry of business and state projects in ancestral lands did not slow down. Illegal mining, state infrastructures, and destructive projects took advantage of the quarantined population, endangering indigenous communities from the COVID-19 and land grabs. Indigenous peoples are for the longest time disproportionately affected by different types of health crises, even before the COVID-19 pandemic. In addition to poverty and inaccessible healthcare services, many indigenous peoples live in isolated or distant villages where services are difficult to get, limited or non-existent. While indigenous communities mitigate the pandemic's impact with communal efforts and traditional practices, the violence, criminalization, killings, and terrorist tagging intensified, and this added another threat to their lives. These attacks, which are linked to state forces and big businesses against the lives of those defending their lands and rights, those protesting against the government's poor pandemic response and anti-people policies, are being carried out with the deadly virus of impunity. The fight against the COVID-19 pandemic has also been weaponized by state forces against indigenous people's struggle for recognition and genuine freedom. The government's failure to address peace, justice, and accountability continues to drive conflict and violence. Issues of internal displacements, land exploitation, and human rights violations remain unaddressed as governments launch fascist attacks against movements for self-determination. But indigenous peoples are not taking this sitting down, making waves in the front lines of defense of rights, land, life, and freedom. Indigenous peoples stand strong even during the pandemic. With their visibility and actions on ground, the victory of assertion is cutting across nations, territories, and communities. It is building unities among indigenous peoples with their allies and advocates. The dominant world order needs more than recovery. It demands transformation. It means ending discrimination, dismantling structures of colonialism and imperialism, eradicating inequality, and destroying the roots of oppression and injustice against indigenous peoples and other marginalized sectors of society.
We are taking the struggle forward.
Onwards with our fight for land, life, and freedom.
Adelante con nuestra lucha por la tierra, la vida y la libertad.
Let's
Let us
unite to win.
Let's unite to win.
Let's unite to win.
Let's unite to win.
Struggle for self-determination and liberation.
video, Unite to Win, which we issued or we made in time for the celebration of the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples. We have been talking about earlier about the book, no? So as discussed by Judel and Jiten, the principles for CSO, civil society organizations, development effectiveness, or the 8 Istanbul principles outlines the minimum standards of effective development work for civil society around the globe, wherever we are. It guides the activities and work of civil society as defined by their mandate and organizational priorities, at the same time enabling them to check their own effectiveness, transparency, and accountability. However, as expounded by our speakers, development effectiveness does not exist in a vacuum. Domestic conditions and global developments impact highly not only on the operations of civil society, but also their effectiveness. Thus, it is equally necessary to have enabling environment where government policies, where international standards are consistent with the Istanbul principles. So the CSO Partnership for Development Effectiveness, or CPDE, Indigenous Peoples Constituency, publishes Grounding the CSO DE Principles, the Indigenous Peoples Principles, and Guidelines on Development Effectiveness, to show the application and practice of the Istanbul Principles on Indigenous peoples. It highlights these principles in the Indigenous peoples' continuing defense of our lands, waters, and territories, in our continuing assertion of self-determination and self-governance, in our continuing promotion of identity and ways of life, and of course, our fight also for freedom and equality. In the book, a copy of the 8 Istanbul Principles can be found, and it also provides another article that discusses the general reframing of these Istanbul Principles from the perspective of people's organizations and social movements. We hope the CPDE Indigenous Peoples Constituency hopes that this booklet would be the first of many publications that actively link CSO development effectiveness principles to the current realities of Indigenous peoples. So our grounding of the Istanbul Principles goes beyond the issue of inclusion, consultation, and participation of Indigenous peoples, but it should work towards the genuine respect and recognition of our right to self-determination. For those of us who are watching us in Facebook, we can avail of the copy through the information provided at the slide. And for those of us who are with us in the Zoom meeting, the details where you can get a copy of this can be found in the chat box. No? So kindly check it out. But we will also be providing you, sending you an email after this. So now, before we go to the question and answer, just to document our briefing session for this evening, for this afternoon, we would like to request everybody to please kindly switch on their cameras so that we will just have a quick picture, and at the same time we get to see who is here with us in the Zoom meeting. I'm glad to see that Lori, our member in the United States, is here with us. Good morning, Lori. We're also happy that NK Kenny from Naga is also here. And then we have our members from the Cordillera in the Philippines, Roda and Bestang. So for those who can switch on their cameras, please switch it on. Then we have with us Maureen Loste. We have also Victoria Lavado with us. And then we have Sunny Oliveros, who will also be helping us with some of the technical writings of our case stories. And then we have our friend Richard with us. Okay, so did we get the picture already? And then our colleagues also from the People's Coalition on Food Sovereignty, our partners, who is the main convener for our event in the upcoming Global People's Food Summit. Okay, so thank you everyone for that. Now we proceed to the question and answer. Are there questions from those who are in the Zoom? You can raise your hand, or you can type it in the chat box. And for those in Facebook, you can send in through comments. But there were also some questions that have been forwarded in email, no? I'd like to ask them, but unless there are questions for those who are joining us live. Where in the Zoom chat, Lori. How come I don't see the question, Lori? Okay. Maybe Jiten, then if Judel can add. We have a question from Lori. Is there a way to end fascist programs directed at indigenous peoples, representative institutions, and these attacks serve the state rather than their own constituency or the indigenous peoples themselves? The demand that we register with the state that attacks us, for example, can change the organization and exhaust resources that could have been used for subsistence without resulting in the state accrediting us. I think what Lori is saying here is that how can we deal with governments who use probably in many cases in Asia, the issue of national interest against indigenous peoples, or use the survival of the state as if they're speaking in behalf of the people outside of indigenous peoples who are largely minoritized. So, Jiten?
Yeah, I will try my level best to answer this question. Yes, it's a reality that the state tries to divide and also cause confusion among many of the indigenous communities. No? And like here in Manipur, and even across Northeast, what we come across is the state as part of subduing indigenous peoples, no? And also as part of the process to exploit or expropriate our land and resources. One of the strategy is to cause division and also confusion among the different indigenous groups. No? And this is an experience that we face, like in our campaign against oil exploration out here. So one of the challenges is, apart from resisting the corporate bodies and the state with the effort, with their forceful and disrespectful effort to plunder our land. One of the effort is to deal with our own people, no? Because sometimes there might be people who also work with across the local government, for example, and in fact the local authority and also members of the community itself, no, will also be used by the government to further the interests of the corporate and also the whoever is profiting from our land resources. And I think that is also part of a challenge. And yeah, so to deal with that, I think we need to be very conscious of what is happening. And I think that's really important. And then we really need to undertake initiatives that includes from community mobilizing, creating awareness and taking time to mobilize. And I think that's really important because what is obvious is the effort to divide the community is often accompanied with misinformation and with false information and false promises sometimes, and saying that, for example, in oil exploration, they said, okay, if the oil exploration comes in, it will bring school and colleges and medical facilities and all kind of and roads. But so then we need to raise awareness and go to the community and mobilize, saying that, suppose if we don't have oil, then are we not going to have school and roads and whatever, so yeah, so it's really important to understand the divisive agenda and also divisive efforts, the misinformation campaign. So that's why it's really important when it comes to the effective agenda, it's really important that we insist on asserting our right to self-determination, our right to self-determined development. And along with that, it's about asserting our right to free, prior, and informed consent. Because when we talk about free, prior, and informed consent, it's about having the right information of both the good impact and also the negative impact. Because often what is happening is the negative impact is not undermined. And related to this question is also the process of vilification and targeting of indigenous organizations and the leader. I think that's an obvious reality. The push for extractive industry, the push for unsustainable energy projects or other destructive unsustainable projects are in the along with the development cooperation process is the direct targeting of the civil society, direct targeting of indigenous organization and leader, and conscripting the whatever voice and whatever space they have. I think this is one of the biggest challenges, and this is a very systematic, very comprehensive process, and like we already said in India, how it's happening, because not just using the criminal law, not just using the repressive laws, you have several laws, National Security Act, Unlawful Activity Prevention Act, but also diluting or forming new laws that undermine indigenous right over land resources. So we are seeing series of laws out here, like the mineral amendment of the mineral laws, for example, and then the environmental laws, for example. And so there are a lot of policy dilutions and deregulation of policy, which happens side by side along with passing of law, specifically directed towards the civil society, like Jodel was mentioning the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act, and there are several amendments to it. Just last year there was an amendment which puts more stringent measures to curb the functioning of civil society. So yeah, I think so. These are a very systematic and very comprehensive process, and I think we need to challenge all of this, and while mobilizing the community. And that's why it's really important that we build more solidarity and more, empowerment and more sharing of, our experiences of dealing with, because it will be good for us to also learn from what is happening in other parts of the world, and also to see and to learn from successful efforts and struggles.
Okay, thank you, Jiten. Judel, would you like to add something to that?
Hi, thanks, Jiten. I totally agree with the points that Jiten raised, particularly on mobilization and continuous assertion and struggle. Just to add, I think it is very important also for partnering and working with other platforms at different levels, national, global, and regional. Particularly if you have, like, for instance, an IP commission in a country that doesn't serve the community, the indigenous communities, but actually serve the interests of the state and also other forces or business interests. So you have to find other venues, spaces where you can actually voice out what is really happening in the country, and partnering with a platform such as IPMSDL and CPDE can actually contribute to that.
Okay, thank you, Judel and Jiten. I think you've mentioned there are different levels where we can do all of this, where we can apply development effectiveness, and there are also various forms. But the way I get it, it's very important that we have strong communities, strong organizations on the ground, and with this, we can do more solidarity, we can do more partnership in our work. There is one question, because Judel, you mentioned earlier that Istanbul, more or less started sometime. I mean, the discussion started probably before 2010, but it was formalized. The CSO development effectiveness was formalized in 2010. So it has been like 10 years, that we have been working or implementing Istanbul principles. What is your assessment in terms of this, the implementation of these principles, and how far have we gone in terms of popularizing or even the use of the Istanbul principles? And maybe we can relate this to later on, I'll have a follow-up question that would also bring in the question of Lori as typed in the chat box.
Yeah, thanks, Bev. So it's actually been 11 years
since
Okay,
the Istanbul Principles were adopted in 2010. So in terms of the progress, so there have been uneven progress in terms of the implementation of the Istanbul Principles. No, so across different constituencies, countries, and organizations. There are some constituencies, for instance, international NGOs have been implementing the principles and actually developed similar initiatives at a more advanced stage. So they're already talking about effectiveness and accountability and transparency of their practice, while other organizations, while not implementing the Istanbul Principles as a whole, have been implementing some elements of the principles as well. So like what I've mentioned earlier, these are not totally new. So maybe our organizations, people's organizations, have been actually working on principle number 1, which is human rights, but they just don't label it as such as Istanbul Principles. No, in terms of CPDE work, we've always been popularizing and implementing the principles since 2012. For instance, the indigenous people sector has a sectoral guidelines on IP implementation, and I'm happy that there's actually a documentation of that already. There are trainings that we've done in the past, and this one as well. There are global standards, country compacts, and at the organizational level, there have been code of conducts, code of ethics that are actually patterned after the Istanbul Principles.
Okay, thank you, Judel. So it seems that, well, at least, no, we are doing the work of popularizing, but never to lose track of the real mandate of civil society organizations, so that we will not also fall into the trap of really just focusing on policy, or probably being caught into the trap of certain what you call this benevolence, so-called benevolence of the state, are probably corporations. GTEM, you are much involved with, I mean, as in the organizing of the Global People's Summit, no, on food systems. So this is our the alternative, no, the counter summit to the UN convened, which involves largely big corporations, no, and governments in the issue of food, but excluding civil society, or what you call this communities, especially indigenous peoples. Is there a possibility, or where does Istanbul Principles or development effectiveness come in when it comes to such mechanisms or intergovernmental processes? Because I think, aside from the Food Summit, this September will be the UNGA, and then the following month will be the Convention of Parties that will look into the issue of climate change, and then you will have the ministerial meeting of the WTO. I mean, these are intergovernmental processes that comes out with protocols and standards. I mean, is there a way that development effectiveness would play into all of these dealings or negotiations? What do you think?
Quite a tough question to answer. I think what's important is to reflect on how development effectiveness is applied in the local community context among the indigenous communities. No, I think that a reality check will really be important, and also to see how the principles are also being implemented in the larger process. What is obvious is, in many of the indigenous community, like in Northeast, we recently have this consultation, and it is quite obvious that indigenous people's land and even the traditional food production system, food systems, and the associated culture and all, is all impacted because of the increased corporatization of development, or increased pursuance of agribusiness. No, and not just on the agribusiness sector, but also the pursuance of unsustainable, large-scale, destructive form of development. I think it also lead to destruction of indigenous people's land and their food systems, like all across the Northeast. I was referring to how large-scale unsustainable, projects like dam and mineral extraction, or even the pursuit of oil palm in our region, how it already undermined, apart from the climate impact, how it all undermined indigenous agriculture or indigenous food systems, and on the part of the government, the impetus is more to promote and facilitate the corporate role in development, including in undermining indigenous people's traditional forms of agriculture. So that's why it's really, really important that when we talk about the partners, the multi-stakeholder partner, the corporate bodies, and also the government, they really need to uphold the effective development standards. We talk about human rights, we talk about transparency, we talk about accountability, we talk about environmental sustainability. And I think these major principles are kind of undermined, are mostly undermined in all this, in most of the development cooperation process that impact on indigenous agriculture. And so if we look at the current global process, the global food system under the UN food system, for example, and there is a larger concern of the corporate capture of this process, and also the continued reinforcement and continued creation of the enabling environment for the corporate agribusiness. And I think that is an alarming process, and this is something that we really need to challenge, and also need to ensure that the effective standards, which includes the issues of human rights and environmental sustainability and others that we talk about, are all upheld. But I think that's a challenge. Like in India, there is, apart from the different policies and different development concern, recently the 3 farm bills are passed now, and this is something that will further lead to more corporatization of agriculture, which means we allow the corporate bodies to control pricing and procurement and contract farming, pursuing contract farming, and all kind of corporatizing of agriculture, and ultimately this is what that will ultimately impact on indigenous agriculture. And right now in Manipur, and also even in Northeast, the ongoing conflict right now is ongoing controversy. Just recently is the issue of oil palm, because the government has announced that Northeast India, and also there is a place called Andaman in Nicobar, like in the Andaman Sea, Bay of Bengal area, and so these 2 areas will be the special focus for promoting palm oil cultivation, and this is in the context of mitigating climate change. And there's just already concern that the pursuance of large palm oil plantations and all over Northeast, in this very fragile biodiversity hotspot area, it will not only lead to destruction of forests, but it will also very much undermine indigenous people's way of life, culture, identity, and also leading to undermining their traditional food systems. And so this is one way that. And then there's already a lot of discussion and a lot of response around that. And we already seen examples of how palm oil, how the push for palm oil in Indonesia and Malaysia, it already led to corporate capture of the entire sector, and how it undermined indigenous people's right, including their own traditional forms of food production system. So we don't want to repeat that process out here.
Okay, Jodel, before we ask some comments from our partners who will be involved in our research, CPDE has been involved in high-level meetings around global partnerships. How is Istanbul being brought into the fore in these processes?
Thanks, Mel. So the Istanbul Principles have actually been recognized by different stakeholders already in GPDC, and we're actually engaging other spaces in the UN, for instance, and we've been promoting the Istanbul Principles. Now, recognition is just one thing. We know it. In paper, it might be good. They recognize it. But there is actually continuous engagement in these stakeholders that the Istanbul Principles is good, and we've actually been popularizing it. We've been implementing it at the organizational level, at least for the CSOs. But there should always be the other side of the Istanbul Principles, which is basically governments and other development actors providing us enabling environment for us to continue our practice, our work, and advocacy. So whenever we go to spaces like the GPEDC, we tell them we monitor the progress, we assess the progress of the Istanbul Principles for a few years already, and we provide evidence on that. Now it's the challenge for them to actually provide us evidence that they're giving us enabling environment. And we actually document that there has not been much progress in terms of enabling environment since 2011. And actually the space is regressing at an unprecedented rate, especially during COVID pandemic.
Okay, thank you, Judel. Do we have questions or feedback from those who are in the Zoom in relation to the inputs? Or do you have questions in relation to the case story research that we are proposing to collaborate with our partners in the different countries? None? Okay, so if there are no questions, again, thank you, Jitem, thank you, Jadel. We will be editing, for the information of everybody, our recorded session will be edited so that we can actually use this also when we conduct different trainings in 4 countries, no? In 4 regions in relation to CSO development effectiveness, alongside the case story research that we would like to develop. Hopefully, after this session, we would receive some expression of interest from our partners that you can work with us for this case stories. We have sent you emails. These are not complicated writings, no, because we would really like to bring out the practice of development effectiveness of indigenous people, especially communities or peoples or organizations. We might not call it Istanbul Principles or development effectiveness, but I am pretty sure that many of us have actually been practicing these 8 principles as outlined by Jodel and Jitem. So we will be sending you emails to follow up on the case story, and maybe if there are any expressions of interest now, we would be glad to take note of those. Rhoda, are you raising your hands? You are muted. Can you unmute si Rhoda? Rhoda Philippines. I don't think she can unmute herself.
Okay. Pwedeng, kasi I just wanted to make clarifications dyan sa case research because it was given, you suggested that to CPA. So can I have clarifications on that? But nga aguray man ta ited ko nanay, apok is nan mama na.
Rhoda is doing her grandmother duties. And she requests for a few minutes just to give back the baby to the mother. Yes, Lori, we can send you the guidelines so you can study it if you are interested to collaborate, no?
Wala umalis. Pero
yes.
Kasi hindi very clear sa akin. What is the objective of this case research? Are we going to present how the CSOs have been using the Istanbul Principles, or how state bodies are using the Istanbul Principles in relation to development aid effectiveness? So is it for the CSOs in their own means What exactly do we want to get from the research? What we want to present and share to other indigenous peoples or other CSOs? Thank you.
Yes. The case research is actually designed wherein we would like to get our partners, probably one or two, to present their experience in the application or the use, or how do they practice the principle in relation to what they call this defense of human rights, or for that matter, how is it practiced, the issue of gender equality. How is this being done by civil society organizations, but more on people's organizations, because our experience is that most of the narratives that we have in relation to development effectiveness comes from non-government institutions or non-government organizations that work more on the global scale. Pero very, very few discourse or narratives are found in relation to the practice of indigenous peoples. Two, it will also aim to sort of expose the what do you call this, the neglect or probably how the state operates in relation to these principles, because supposedly in writing that includes the Philippine government, I mean most of our governments, they have signed in different high-level political fora that they do recognize civil society organizations, one, as development actors in their own right, two, they are also equal partners with states, with UN agencies, and even private sector, supposedly to bring in development per se. So this is actually a first of our efforts in the indigenous people's constituency, just to bring out the stories from the ground. It's as simple
So it's more,
as that. Yes.
so
And
it's more of a positive presentation.
Yes, for indigenous peoples, because the narrative is that indigenous peoples or CSOs are actually do not practice effectiveness principles. I mean, they speak of transparency and accountability. I mean, always asking state to do this, but they themselves do not do it. They speak of human rights, but within their own organization, there is discrimination on women, girls, and the youth. They speak of partnership, but their partnership is only limited to like-minded organizations. They do not have the capacity, or they are averse to working with governments or UN agencies or other NGOs that have a different probably view on what development is. So that is what we would like to bring out in the case stories.
Thank you. I hope I got it.
Yes. There's a letter, and then we have formulated some guidelines. Because one of the feedbacks of the indigenous peoples when it comes to development effectiveness, they really find it so technical. And I think also even governments themselves find it more technical. So this is our way of grounding and simplifying it, that, even without Istanbul, we have been practicing solidarity and partnerships. We have been practicing gender equality. Yan. Pero since it would be very difficult for one organization to discuss all, our proposal is probably each partner will focus on one specific principle. I think the proposal for on CPA or with CDPC will be to come out with a case story in relation to solidarity and partnership, because I think in the previous discussions you have a very rich experience in working with governments, or other agencies or international institutions. I think for the Northeast, GTEM, the proposal when we had the first discussion was on the issue of environment, no? In relation to these 101 dams that have been set up in the Northeast alone, and also the sustainability of these projects, especially that these are funded by various types of financial institutions. For Africa, if I'm not mistaken, the proposal would be not on human rights, I think on women and girls, how these are incorporated in the organizations that we work with. I mean, so far, those are the initial interests that came in. So that's it. But if you want, you can also take probably 2 case stories if that's possible, because so far not many have expressed yet their interest. No? These are just short and simple case stories, and then hopefully after this we can do some trainings, and then the trainings will not be because we were able to get some resources to conduct trainings at country and different communities in different countries, and that includes South Asia, Southeast Asia, Philippines, Malaysia. For Africa would be Nigeria and Kenya, I think, no? While these are trainings on development effectiveness, it is also flexible enough that we can implement these trainings also to respond to the needs of our member organizations or partners. So if it's more of human rights documentation, then we can do that. We will just have to probably make some adjustment, but still prioritizing the design or the training needs of our members and communities. Okay, are there any more questions? I think we are running out of time because we promised that we will only have 1 hour and 30 minutes, and we have 3 minutes left. So we would like to thank Jodel and Jiten again for the input, and for our partners who have joined us in the Zoom and in Facebook. And then we also thank the Secretariat who are still here. Like many of us, we're also learning on development effectiveness. And thank you very much. And we look forward to your communications with us in relation to these projects that we have in mind. And maybe we can further discuss this bilaterally if you have other questions, details in relation to this. So with that, thank you, everybody. Nice to see all of you who have joined here, and we hope to see you in the next events of our constituency.